Hey guys, how are ya? Mary Rose here for another Wednesday live stream talking about writing, talking about story structure, talking about the path of development as a writer. You know, we don't fall out of the crib knowing how to write a novel. It's something that we learn how to do. If it's something we're passionate about doing, it's something we do take the time to learn how to do. And I'm so pleased to see some of you here live. If you're watching on the replay, that's awesome too. It's all good. If you are here live and you're watching from Facebook, you know the drill by now. You can go to streamyard.com/Facebook and get permission to show your name if you haven't done it before. And this way, if you want to participate by asking questions, which I hope you do, I will know who you are, which should be awesome. In fact, let me open up the comment box right now so you guys can start to participate anytime you want. Let me know you're here and let me know where you're watching from. That's always fun to know. Okay. So listen, I didn't mean to be provocative by calling this live stream to pants or not to pants. In the current day that we live in, where most of us are having a lot of our interactions, professional and even interpersonal interactions, on some variety of a Zoom call or a live stream or like an experience like we're having right now, where there's like the top of me. The mystery of whether people have pants on or not is definitely one that runs, right? It runs through people's minds. That's not what we're here to talk about today. If anybody showed up for, for something, a little risque, that's not what we're going today. I want to tell you what I mean by this question: to pants or not to pants. We're going to define some terms. Pantser. What's a pantser? A lot of writers know this already. And I got someone watching from Texas. Hello, Texas. I'm so glad to see you here. I can't see your name. If you want me to see your name, you've got to do that little StreamYard trick, right? That I just had up here, and let me know that you're here. But if you don't want me to know your name, that's fine. I'm happy to blow you a big kiss from here to Texas. I'm in California, broadcasting live on Facebook and YouTube. So I'm glad that there is some relief coming in also in the comments that we're not going to talk about our lower extremities. It's not what we're here to do. But the term pantser to writers means something very particular. It means the type of writer who writes by the seat of her pants. What does that mean? It means that you're kind of in improv mode. You sit down to work, or you sit down even to begin a new project with very little idea of what's going to happen. These are the writers that tend to feel that they have to feel kind of inspired, that they're waiting for the muse to come, that something great is going to happen, if they just kind of show up to work. And they are not wrong. Let me tell you, the people who say, oh, I'm a pantser, I just go with it, I just do whatever happens that day. It's not that they're wrong, because things do happen when we sit down to work. And I'm going to talk about that. The process of sitting down to work, even the process of like getting our fingers moving on the keyboard or getting your pen moving across the yellow legal pad, if that's how you roll, that is, that sort of triggers because of the power of habit, that sort of triggers the creative juices to start to flow in a way. And for some people, a lot of productive work can come that way. So those people are the pantsers. Now, some people are proud pantsers. Some people are like, I'm committed to pantsing. I'm gonna go for it without a lot of, forethought. I'm gonna just dive in and see where my creativity takes me. Proud pantsers, I salute you. Here's the thing. Not all pantsers are proud pantsers. A lot of pantsers are very nervous pantsers because they are jumping out of a plane every time they sit down to work. And they sometimes get like issues, right? They sometimes have problems like getting stuck, or I sat down and the creative juices weren't flowing that day, and it was a bad day. I'll try again tomorrow. Another bad day, I'll try again tomorrow. Pretty soon, like sometimes that just gets into a stuckness that starts to last. And then those people say, well, I've run out of ideas. That project is no good. I'll just start something new. That's my solution. That one, the creative juice is kind of trickled out into a drought. So clearly there's no project there. Clearly that's not a book, right? So I'm just going to start something new. That's the danger of being a pantser, is that you're at the mercy of what happens when you sit down to write. So we're going to return to this. What's the opposite of a pantser? Well, it's the outliners. It's the people who really believe and practice that you need an outline before you can begin to work. You have to have it sorted in your head. You have to have it all mapped out. And these people, bless their hearts, are often very diligent about their work process because it has an architectural quality to it. And they get an idea for a book and they do their research and they map it out and they write the whole outline. So by the time they actually sit down to write the book, they're following a template that they've created, and those people are the ones who will say, oh yeah, I easily write 3,000-4,000 words a day, because they're not thinking of new things necessarily. They may be, they're thinking of the words, they're writing it out, but it's all been laid out already. They're sort of following the treatment that they've already created for the book, right? That's what the outline is. So those are the outliners. Here's the thing. Pantsers and outliners, it's kind of like my recent book, Alice's Farm, A Rabbit's Tale. You can see it on my shelf. It's like rabbits and farmers. It's rabbits and farmers. Like, can the two ever get along? Is there a way to say I'm a pantser and I'm an outliner without, offering the subtle judgment that the other way is not the right way, right? That the other way is like, one worries, right? The anxious pantsers, like, oh, outliners look at us pantsers as people who simply don't have the discipline or, cognitive capability or whatever to just write a dang outline. Just write the outline. What's stopping you? We're too lazy. We're too undisciplined to write an outline. And so there's a little bit of shame. The pantser feels a little shame in the presence of the confident outliner who always knows where they're going. Similarly, though, deep in their heart of hearts, the outliner wonders if they aren't being somewhat superficial, if they aren't being somewhat mechanical in their process, if there is not, in fact, a deeper truth that a writer who was just full of creative genius and inspiration would not need such a structured approach, would not need to build such a container, right, in order for them to accomplish their goals. So both camps have their concerns. So I want to talk about my hot take on this, the pantser versus outliner conundrum. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I've been getting some really terrific emails and questions from people who've been watching these live streams, and it's really making me happy. So if you've got stuff to say, please say it. Leave comments. Let me know what you want me to talk about. So this is a great question that came in. It's in two parts, so I'll read it to you. So one of my awesome followers sent me an email that said, how long do you spend figuring out what your story is going to be? And when do you know it's time to start writing? And then continue to share, I haven't yet found the balance between writing without knowing what's going on and spending so much time on developing it that I never end up writing. Isn't that an awesome question? It has a lot of self-knowledge, that question, right? Because this is a writer who already understands the point that I want to make today, which is that there is a balance between writing without knowing what's going on and development. Let me put that away. I am going to imagine, right, that those of you who are watching live can really relate in some aspect to this dilemma. Whether we consider ourselves pantsers or outliners, or whether we've never thought about those labels before today, still there is that problem of how to begin, right? Do we sit around trying to map out a story, even if only in our heads, before we allow ourselves to start writing? If so, how much do we need to know? How much do we have to have worked out before we actually allow ourselves to, type chapter 1? It was a dark and stormy night. Like, how do we get into it? How much do we need to know? Is it okay to know nothing? Is that even possible? Do we need to know like more or less what happens in the first chapter? Do we need to know more or less what happens in the first third of the book, the first half of the book? Do we need to know what happens in the whole book? Right? Well, how much do we need to know before we allow ourselves to begin? So, as my wise reader says, there is a balance between those two things. So, I have news for the pantsers and the outliners out there. All writers are pantsers and all writers are outliners. All that differs from writer to writer is what your most productive balance is between those two. When in your process you incline toward pantsing and when you incline toward outlining, right? When do you do which? You don't stay in pantsing mode for a whole book, nor do you write an outline and slavishly follow it with no space left for invention while you're writing. The extremes don't work. All of us actually are a combination of those two things. And what you find through training and experience is which process works best for you. And you also might find that even if you have a process that you found that balance, it may change from book to book. There may be some books that because there's a complexity about them in terms of structure that you want to have more of a roadmap, right? And there may be some books that you just feel are so connected perhaps to your protagonist's journey that you just know this character so deeply that you can do a lot of pantsing and be fruitful. So let's talk about how to find that balance. And I'm going to share a comment that just came in from Paul. Glad to see you again, Paul. It's great to have you here in the live stream. Paul says, I don't know if this is useful, but I often find myself planning until I run into a brick wall and then write out the story until I realize what to plan for, back and forth until you get something whole, right? So that is a really great process that includes this idea of balance. Totally, Paul. I really relate to this. You find yourself planning until you run into a brick wall, and you don't have to run into a brick wall. You don't have to take things that far. Here's my thought about getting started, right? Is that you have some idea, you have some notion, some little seed, and that seed could be really small. It could be a snippet of overheard conversation. It could be something that happened to someone that that you can't stop thinking about. It could be, an idea that you got when you were reading a book that you love, and it sort of sparked a wish to write something in a similar vein or genre, or, it really, we don't know. It's the most common question writers get asked, by the way, once you're out there in the world and people know you're a writer and they want to interview you on their blogs and so on. It's like, where did you get your ideas? Where'd you get the idea for this book? Where'd you get the idea for that book? It's always sort of an impossible question to answer, but we become adept at having an answer for that because so many people ask it. But the truth is, the book that I'm working on now, I had an idea that sprang from a title idea that came to me. And I thought, oh my goodness, I need to write that book. I need to write the book that goes with that title. Much as a songwriter might come up with a refrain and then write a song, that pays off in that refrain. But I don't say, oh, cool, I know what the title is. Let me sit down to work. It just then triggers a series of interesting questions. Well, if that's the title, who's the main character? Aha. Start to think about your main character a little bit. Immediately, when you start to think about your main character, you must think about what the problem is. What issue do they have that this story is going to bring to some kind of fulfillment, right? That it's going to allow the problem to be solved. It's going to allow the problem to be addressed and perhaps never solved. It's going to, there will be a happy ending, a sad ending, or a mixed ending, but there is going to be some issue that is of sufficient depth and meaning that it's enough to sustain an entire narrative. And that issue, I'm talking sort of thematically right now, right? That issue is whether it's the search for identity, whether it's coming of age, whether it's, um, uh, dealing with existential loneliness, whatever it is, that's kind of bubbling up, the need for a family, the need for independence, there's all kinds of things. I shouldn't say all kinds. There actually are not all kinds of themes. We're human beings. We have way more in common than we have differences. And so the kinds of themes that speak to us actually, mostly fall into those kinds of categories of self-actualization, the seeking of connection, the finding of meaning in life. These are the things that drive humans. And so therefore they are the things that drive storytelling. And that's so your main character starts to have a quality about them. Is this a person who needs to kind of go out in the world and make a mark? Or is this a person who needs to be healed? Is this, what does this character need to learn? And that can all stay like a little bit under the surface, right? Very quickly that manifests into a plot. I don't use the word plot that often because I just think that it's confusing. But in fact, it's a useful term. The plot is like the ABCD of what happens in the story. And so, if you are imagining a story about a lonely teenager who needs to rebalance her home life so that she's not overlooked, there's nobody, for her to really feel close to, and that, I mean, that's sort of going on with her. And then the plot is, well, she gets swept away by a tornado, and the thing that happens is that she needs to figure out how to get home. That she was saying, I don't belong here. In fact, I want to run. And so adventures with Tin Men and Scarecrows and Cowardly Lions ensue. That's all the plot. That's what happens, right? But what we're really talking about is this the problem that a teenager has attached to the family, wanting to be independent, and the tug of war. It's actually very astute. It's a very astute look at adolescence, right? How we long to be free, but we also long to be home. And that, those kinds of struggles stay with us our whole lives, that we ourselves have opposing impulses, and we spend our lives just sort of struggling to sort these out. So you can sort of be stirring the pot of the feeling that lies underneath. And it's a way of planning. It's a kind of planning, right? And then you can maybe get a couple of plot ideas. Well, the character lives in a place, and this is the event, right? That's going to knock over this delicate, unstable house of cards that is this world that they live in the beginning, that has this problem in it. This problem needs to be solved. So the situation is unstable. Now, when I use these terms, I'm really talking about story structure. We haven't outlined anything yet, right? So I haven't said, okay, on page 2, this has to happen, and on page 5, this has to happen, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this question, this great question of how much do you have to know before you allow yourself to begin writing. And what I suggest to you is that if you start out knowing a tiny bit of information, I have this impulse to write about a woman in a purple hat, it comes to you. Fine. That's a great, knock on the door. Like maybe there's a story waiting at the door, but no more. That's already maybe not so enough to get started drafting a manuscript, but it's plenty to sit down and kind of half close your eyes and just do some free writing. Who might this woman be? Where might she live? What might be bothering her? What sort of troubles does she have? What kind of adventure would be so outside her usual comfort zone that it would be worthy to write a whole story about, and that what kind of adventure might, bring her to completion, put her on this journey, right? So none of this feels to me like outlining, but there's a lot of exploration that goes on, and you must be willing to let go of the misapprehension that writing is an organized process that happens in any way resembling finished books. Writing is far more like what goes on in an artist's studio, where they might go in and there's a blank canvas. They're not even going to look at the canvas. First, they're going to get out the sketchbooks and the pencils, and they're going to sketch stuff, and they're going to walk around the neighborhood. Maybe they'll take photographs. They'll seek inspiration. They'll get ideas, and things will start to happen. Like, oh, this color combination seems really interesting. Although the light is falling on this building is really interesting to me. They're going to noodle. They're just going to noodle. They may fill sketchbooks with ideas, 90% of which will never end up in the finished painting, right? Then they're going to go back and they're going to mix colors, and they're going to do all kinds of preparatory stuff. By the time they actually get to the canvas, there's something in mind. They're not going to waste a big, expensive, stretched canvas they're not going to use it as a sketch pad. They're going to sketch in a sketch pad with pencil. They're not going to care what it looks like. They're just exploring. They're trying to broaden their understanding of their own impulse. Writers often skip the sketch pad part of the creative process for good reason. I think I said last time, when we long to write well, and we have books on the shelves that we love and we admire, and those books are part of what inspire us to want to write well, we don't get to watch that person write that book. We don't say, oh, I need to learn how to write a book that's this good. Therefore, I'm going to find a writer at this level, and I'm going to sit next to them while they work, and then I will know how to do it. You're not going to see anything, right? You can, if you want to come over here and have me teach you to write, fine. You can sit next to me. If you just watch me go, if you're not going to learn anything, I can teach you how to write, but not through you watching me. You're not going to see my sketch pads because they're up here. Maybe they're in a little document that I keep hidden in a corner of my laptop, You're not going to see them. And we too easily, at the beginning of our development as writers, think that good writers or talented writers or whatever, gremlin language we use to make it seem like it's inaccessible to us, that they don't make these messes, that they don't play in they don't take out the mud and just make mud pies all over the place. They do. They absolutely do. We don't get to see that because there's no evidence of it in the finished work. The better the writer does his or her job, the more effortless and inevitable the finished product looks. The more they hide the seams, the more they hide the work, because they've taken it to that level. They don't need for the reader to read this book and be noticing, oh, wow, this book must have been so hard to write. Wow, this book, look at look at all the effort that went into this book. If that's what your reader is thinking when they're reading, you haven't fully done your job, because you don't want your reader thinking about anything. You want them immersed in the story, right? A well-written narrative is an immersive experience for the reader. They're in it. They're experiencing it as something that happens to them. So there's many, many, many phases of the writing process that end up, rightly so, being invisible to the reader. So what we have to do when we want to develop as writers is we really have to take off our reader hat and put on our writer hat and sort of shift. We're not consumers anymore. We're producers. We have to learn how the producers do it, and we have to, be willing to change our conception of what the process is like. So lots of noodling can lead to outlining if you are so inclined to outline. But what shape does your outline take? Now, I can share with you what I believe works for me and works for my students. this is hard-won wisdom from a lot of years of writing and a lot of years of teaching. I don't think that a strict template of this always happens in this scene and this happens in that scene, helps. I think there's a lot of screenwriting instruction that is pretty rigid in that way. But I do have a tremendous fondness, a real dedication to the kind of mythic structure that people like Joseph Campbell have put forth, that has become known as hero's journey structure. And it's not a template. It's not, it's not a paint by numbers approach at all. What it is to me is a set of really, really time-tested, resonant metaphors that have tremendous accuracy in the way they understand the human experience, how people grow and change. It's just a beautiful model of how human beings develop. And whether that, I'll give you just a couple of examples, right? Whether that's the truth that when change comes for us, it's sometimes unwillingly. Sometimes we are stuck in our lives, and that stuckness will get toppled by an outside force if we are really unwilling to make a necessary change. Something's going to happen that's going to force us to change. And when that something happens, we're going to fight it tooth and nail. People resist change. So, in the hero's journey material, there's this really interesting stage of the journey called the refusal of the call that depicts this. It explores it. It kind of unravels it psychologically as a storyteller. When we start to be familiar, when we have some training in story structure, we can find nuance in how our stories develop without necessarily outlining, right? Without having to work out the minutia of what happens in the plot beat by beat. But we have a sense, because we've got some story structure training, of this is going to happen, and I know that there's going to be some resistance. Let's invite, now I can pants a little bit. I'm not flying blind. What I'm doing is I'm inviting a creative improv almost on paper of how might my hero, how might my protagonist react to the opportunity to change that's being presented to them. Are they going to embrace it wholeheartedly without any resistance? Or, I don't know, story structure suggests to me that there might be some resistance. Where might that resistance come from? Will it come from inside them? Will they have a certain kind of fear? Or will they have a defensive reaction, an ego response of like, I'm fine the way I am. I don't need to change. Thank you very much. That like Bilbo Baggins does, right? Bye-bye. No adventures for me. Thank you. Be on your way. So is it fear, or is it shame? But what will the neighbors think? Is it something that gets expressed in story terms as an outside force? Do they say, well, maybe I am ready for an adventure. Maybe I do want to change. And then other forces say, how dare you? No. If you do that, you can't be part of our group anymore. That's another form of this threshold guardian energy, we call it, right? That all gets sort of wrapped up in this notion of the refusal of the call. It's never simple. It's fraught with peril. It's a ride in a flying house borne by a tornado. But it's not easy to go from one state of being to another. So when we know that, when we have some story structure to play with, what it does is it kind of gives us a scaffold that we then, even when we're inclined toward pantsing, we're never without a map, because we can play with the stages of the journey and know that we are safe within them, that if we improvise, if we pants our way through a writing session, we're not like, I don't know what to do today. It's just a blank page. No. You sit down and you're like, okay, where am I in my story? Well, my hero really is confronted with an opportunity to change. How are they going to react? What's going to happen, right? The call to adventure comes and the Dursleys hide the letters again and again and again and again, right? You can weave a tremendous amount of material out of exploring how far can you take this, right? How far can you take the refusal of the call, the barriers to change? It just gives you, like, you're improvising on a theme, like a jazz musician does, right? There's a beat, there's a chord progression. And once you have that, then you can really find some fun. Now, you can tell from the way that I'm talking that I really admire, in a sense, the freedom to pants. And I'm revealing something about my own process here. But the but I'm a fiend for story structure, and my students will tell you I'm absolutely dedicated to story structure. And this is why. It's because I feel, in a way, that it provides the best of both worlds. It gives you this, like, sense that you can never really get lost. You have a tremendous structure holding you up. And it's not a structure that you outlined last week. It's a structure that's been around for thousands of years, honestly, right? It's a structure that resonates in stories from all cultures and all eras. So it's pretty solid. It's pretty trustworthy, right? It's not a template, but it's a set of metaphors that are really useful to work with. If you have that, you're never lost. It's never a blank page. You are always somewhere in that hero's journey. Your hero is someplace within it. And so you have a tremendous amount of information. And what it gives you is the security of having that outline feeling, but also the freedom to improvise like a jazz musician who's working within music theory, right? That's, to me, is like a useful metaphor. Now, part of I just want to say hello to my Facebook user in Tunisia. I'm glad you're here. That's fantastic. Really, really great to see you. And if you look up further in the comments and you see people telling me that they are wearing pants, don't get nervous. We're not talking about what we're wearing. We're talking about story structure. So what is it out? So when is the balance? Where's the balance? This is sort of the original question. How do you know where to begin? I strongly suggest that you have a little something to go on, that when you do begin, that you begin in sketchbook mode, and that you cultivate enough of an expertise with story structure that even before you write the first words of your book, you know what a beginning contains. You know what has to be in the beginning. The beginning, we meet the character. The beginning, we meet the world of that character. We find out what's wrong, and we get a sense of what might turn the tables for this character. What kind of journey might suit them to a T, even if they don't know it yet. Even if Bilbo doesn't know yet what awaits him, the minute we meet him and we learn what a little conventional homebody he is and how driven he is by the, kind of strict, materialist, judgmental nature of his fellow hobbits, and that he himself is not fully that, and that he has been suppressing a true part of his nature his whole life. We already know the table is laid. We know what's going to happen. And we can't wait for it to happen. And lo and behold, it happens almost immediately. It's such a swift and beautifully constructed beginning in The Hobbit. Gandalf comes, says, "You, sir, are going on an adventure." There's this magnificent refusal of the call where Bilbo, it's the last thing Bilbo was going to do, is go on any messy, uncomfortable adventure, right? It's the last thing he's going to do, but of course he's going to end up having to do it. How much do we know just by understanding story structure? The hero, what's wrong, the arrival of something that's going to topple that hero's status quo, an adventure that's, that bespoke suit, that custom designed adventure that is designed to get them out of their comfort zone, over the hurdle into an adventure. Their refusal and what might take them to do it is, this is also from Hero's Journey work, is there some mentorship, mentor energy? Somebody might say, there's more to you than you think. Maybe you ought to reconsider. It can be a huge piece of mentorship. It can be a subtle piece of mentorship. That the character who begins the book is in a state of sort of stuckness or dissatisfaction, something is going to change it. And by the time they accept this call to adventure that's going to bring them into the second act, something has already shifted. because now all of a sudden they are able to contemplate the possibility of change. That may be all that shifted. It may be like a tiny tick on the dial of change. But the Bilbo Baggins who runs out of his house after the dwarves is not the same Bilbo Baggins we meet on page 1. The adventure has not even started yet. But this stirring of the pot, of breaking up of his ego and kind of tempting him with promises of gold and challenging him with like, well, we don't think you're any good. And Gandalf saying, no, 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 you're wrong about Bilbo. It's like this beautiful, like, you know, the Play-Doh machine where you turn the crank. It's just this constant churning of story energy that brings our hero to the place where he is able to say yes. He's still like at the beginning of the game board, but all of that happens in the first act or the beginning. So guess what? If you understand what happens in the beginning, whether it's the beginning of The Hobbit, the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, the beginning of Jane Eyre, the beginning of your story is going to be the same. And if you understand what goes into it, it doesn't really feel blank at all. You can pants or you can outline, but you're doing it within a framework. Here's the danger, and danger is a strong word, but here's where you can feel so excited, like, okay, I've got some story structure. I know what belongs in the beginning. I'm going to outline the whole thing. I'm going to write it all out in advance. I'm going to really write a treatment. That may work beautifully if you've done enough sketching, right? If you really have done enough sketching, that may work well for you. I believe for most of us, what happens then is that when we do sit down to write and we get into the flow and we get into the zone, we're going to start to get new ideas. It's going to start to want to go off into what might feel like tangents. You know, we're going to look at our outline and we're going to be like, but that's not what's in my outline. And we're going to get a little like, oh, should I do what's in my outline? Should I follow this idea? Well, this idea seems really compelling. Let me follow it. You know, let me see where it goes. Pretty soon you've left your outline behind and there's no way to get back without throwing away the last 10 pages that you wrote. And you end up having your version of the same kind of anxiety of the absolute pantser who's not working from any kind of story structure framework and who's just going to feel their way through, right? They're just going to feel it. You end up having your version of the same problem, which is confusion. I'm not exactly sure what to do next. This is where I quote Albert Einstein. Are you psyched? Did you know I was going to quote Albert Einstein today? I love to quote Albert Einstein. I'll probably misquote Albert Einstein, but what he said was that no worthy problem gets solved within the framework of its original conception. And what that means is that you start by asking a question, whether you're a fiction writer or a scientist who's trying to cook up a new theorem. You start by posing a question and then you undertake to answer that question. And the deeper you dig into it, the more experiments you run, the more data you gather, the more you understand the limitations of your original question. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments if that makes sense to you guys. You are asking a question in a state of relative ignorance, but you need to pose it in order to get your research started. When you are well into your research, there's going to be the day that you go, okay, now I understand. We're asking the wrong question. But now I know what is the right question. And then you reframe your investigation, and now the work can happen. I feel that this happens to writers almost inevitably, that you start working on something and you noodle and you sketch and you draft and you play with it. Maybe you get a bunch of pages written, and at a certain point you're like, aha, now that I'm 20 pages in, 30 pages in, now I know what I'm writing. You might have to go back and start over at that point, right? But you've gone deep enough that you now understand the question that you're asking. Now you understand what your character's all about. Maybe, and this is really significant, everyone, Maybe you've written enough to understand from what deep well of feeling and personal emotional material that this book is arising from, right? We sometimes, operate in this like way, like, oh, I just had this idea for a book, blah, 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 blah. We get into it and we're like, oh no, I'm writing about me. I'm writing about that time when I, had this, experience that shaped me for the rest of my life. You will find yourself, if you're working honestly and authentically, there's going to come a day when you're like, oh, this is all about me. Well, who else could it be about? I mean, honestly, if you're writing authentically and with some courage, who else could it be about? But we don't always start out knowing in what way this, the tuning fork of this story is actually, vibrating to the tune of our deepest emotional truths. This is a good thing. And it doesn't mean that all writing is memoir. And it doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean you're a narcissist, that you can only write about yourself. What it means is that you're willing to be vulnerable and work from a place of emotional truth and authenticity. And I do think that most of you will agree with me that the really, really best books are like that they come from an honest place in the author. And that when we read those books, not only do we fall in love with that main character, not only is that an unforgettable story that we want to go back to again and again, but there is some sense, rightly or wrongly, that we have gotten a little glimpse of the author's heart on the other side, and that feeling of connection is also a part of what makes us feel attached to books. It makes us feel attached to them and makes us interested in what else that author has to say. Most of us will have that experience. If we find a book we really love, we're like, what else? Who else? What else did that author write? Because that you're going to get a glimpse of that same person in there if they're working authentically. So these are really, really fundamental questions, but in a practical sense, what I really encourage everybody to do is to not automatically think that planning is bad, and to not automatically think that not planning is bad, but to understand that we all do these things. We all sketch and ruminate and try different possibilities. And then we all think ahead a little bit or a lot. And if you think ahead a lot, you must hold space to change your outline. Your outline, if you need to have a version of the whole book written in outline as like a security blanket, on the corner of your desk, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you are willing to be like Albert Einstein and to stay open to the discoveries that your research is going to present. Don't rule out the better, deeper idea just because it wasn't in the outline that you wrote at the beginning, when you knew this much about your story. You only knew the surface layer. You hadn't taken the dive into the pool yet. So after you're working on it for a while, so much will want to change. And so that process, that's one that's very familiar to me. Working with Hero's Journey structure always, so that there's never that sense of like, I'm completely stuck. Like you're never completely stuck. All stories have this kind of wonderful shape. And if you know what it is, you can always go to it. It's always there. It's a great consolation. And then you start getting a lot of ideas. You're like, well, I want to hold on to these ideas. I think I have a pretty good idea of what happens, in the middle and the scene. And I've got a vision for the ending. Absolutely. Don't let those ideas go to waste. Don't forget them. Keep track of them. Put them in outline form. I have a little a new practice that I'm playing with where I use that project planning tool, which is free. It's called Asana. Some of you might use it to organize your to-do list, but I find that if I just open up a little Asana board and jot all my plot ideas, then it's pretty easy to put them where they belong, right? According to Hero's Journey structure, I can drag things. So, well, that's clearly a second act thing, or no, that'll happen in the third act. I can move stuff around pretty easily. There's all kinds of tools that help you do that. Lots of writers just use Post-it notes and index cards. That is old school, but it works. So don't lose your ideas. Don't forget about them. Don't refuse to write them down because you're not up to that part of the book yet. Books don't have to be written in order. You can sketch things that when you're first going at it, you're in sketch mode. You can sketch all kinds of things. You can sketch the ending before you've even written the middle. These are useful exercises, but you must remember that the process remains loose, 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 loose until well into revision. It's the IKEA furniture approach. Do not tighten the screws until you've put the whole thing together. All right. Now, I'm going back to my friend's original question, um, about how, how much to work on what you've got and how much to go forward. This becomes a form of procrastination sometimes if we've written something and we're looking at it like it's a piece of IKEA furniture, right? It's a bookcase or something, and we've put the sides in and we've put one shelf in, and we're like, I like what I did. I know there's like 8 more shelves to add, and then there's the cap, and I've got to put the feet on, but I really like how this one shelf looks. I'm going to tighten the screws. I just want the satisfaction of tightening up the screws on this one shelf. Well, it's going to happen. You're going to tighten it, and then when you go to put the next shelf in, it's not going to work because it's too tight now. Like there's no give in it. And so you just made it harder for yourself. You've just made it harder for yourself. You feel like you've really got to tighten everything up as you go because you just want the satisfaction of it being really sturdy. Maybe you're going to pretend, oh, I'll put a book on it now. It's like, don't put any books on it yet. Just leave it loose. It's a mess. It's going to be in pieces on the floor for months, for as long as it takes you to get through a draft and a revision. It's just going to be messy and loose. And we have to deal with that. We have to have faith in the process. That if we're just willing to be uncomfortable and live with our messy, messy, loose draft, that later on, when all of the shelves are put in and the feet are in place and the cap is on and we can see that it all fits together, then we can tighten all the pieces. And that's when you really go back and polish the language. That's a kind of a whole separate exercise in a way. Polishing the language, really dealing with the word by word revision. There's no sense in spending weeks polishing paragraphs and pages that you are then going to realize you have to cut, right? Like that's not an efficient way to work. It's a kind of an expensive form of procrastination. So don't get overwhelmed with it. Keep that looseness going. Yeah. Let's see. I'm just going to check the comments. Wonderful comment from Terry. Writing the characters can be a way to get to know them and find their voice before setting them off on their adventure. Absolutely. I mean, when you think about structuring a whole narrative and you realize that the middle, the second act, is the most of it, that's the adventure that's where all the tests, trials, and revelations, to quote Joseph Campbell, the trials and revelations of the second act, that's where the change really, it happens for your main character. So it's not unusual, in my experience, to spend a fair amount of time on that beginning, longer than you think. We're so eager to get to the second act. But when you have your beginning, by which I mean what I talked about earlier, really understanding your main character's problem, what are the circumstances of their world that are unsustainable, right? What might happen to change them, and what kind of adventure might be exactly the kind of thing that they need, not what they want to have happen, what they need to have happen. The storytelling gods are very wise, and they will send the adventure that your hero needs, whether they know it or not. So exploring character in the first act it's really, really valuable. It's really valuable. All that you can discover about your character. But don't tighten the screws too fast. Don't feel like you have to have it all nailed down before you proceed. I can tell, and thanks for that great comment. I can tell from Paul's comment that he is a fellow fan of Tolkien's writing and world. In this great comment, Paul, the history of Middle Earth is so valuable. Seeing Tolkien's long attempts to make something good out of his Hobbit sequel is incredibly encouraging, right? All his sketches laid bare. Exactly. I mean, he was driven by other things, right? I'm not a Tolkien scholar, but I do know that he had vast, you know, passion for languages, for inventing languages. His experiences in the war to process. He had a very traumatic experience being a soldier in World War One. He saw things. He lost all his buddies got killed, and he went through a lot of stuff in his life that sort of found its way into his books. And but the world building and the language building and the culture building was in and of itself a passion of his, and so he spent tremendous time, and I'm sure had a lot of pleasure in developing all that stuff, even perhaps without knowing how it was going to get deployed in the actual work, which is whimsily called the Hobbit sequel, because of course Lord of the Rings is a vast it's a vast work, multi-volume work, far more complicated than The Hobbit, which in my opinion is just like a beautiful standalone masterpiece, even though it does lay the table for what was to come. But in and of itself, it's a remarkable example of a beautifully structured book. Hero's journey all the way. So let me know, do you guys have any other questions about pantsing versus outlining? How much you need to know in order to begin? These are the themes of today. So, oh yeah. Paul's got another great question, and let me bring it up, and I'll give you a quick answer. And then if it's something that we can do another session on, absolutely. I love the suggestion. A lot of trouble nailing down a character's need, Paul says, mainly because need is such a vague term that means nothing without being paired with for X to happen. Interesting. So you're using this word need, right? And so I'm going to translate it into, my terminology so that maybe we can, both of us sort of broaden what we mean by those words. What a character needs and is they may not know what they need, right? If you asked Dorothy Gale, do you need to be swept away by a tornado and go to a strange land full of witches and munchkins? She's like, she doesn't need that. What does she need? She needs not to be so lonely. But she herself might not be able to say that, She herself might not fully understand her emotional state. But the storytelling gods know. They know what she needs. She's living on a farm her whole life. She's seen the same faces over and over again. There are no other kids around, and only friend she's got is her dog. What does she need? She needs to get off that farm, see the world, have a sense of herself in a broader way, and also, shake things up at home so that when she does make it back, she is the focus of everybody's attention. The same farmhands and aunt and uncle who had no time to deal with her before are now, you are our number one priority. It rebalanced her whole community, right? So if you stop thinking of it too literally, you realize there was a world out of balance. The hero goes on this journey and the world is put back into balance. So the word need, because it's a colloquial word, like, what do we need? Oh man, I need a vacation. I need a nap. I need a snack. I need a lunch break. It's a word that has, because it has an everyday use, we can mistake it for like what the character wants or what would console or please the character at that time. But the truth is, when we're talking in story terms and our goal is to create an adventure that creates a deep and meaningful transformation of consciousness, that's Joseph Campbell's phrase again too, not just I changed my hairstyle, I changed my look. It's not a superficial change. It's a permanent change. It's a new way of being. Prince Hal hangs out with Falstaff and is a rabble rouser, but then he must transform into a king. When, you know, he has to change. He can never go back to being a drunken brawler in the pubs playing pranks. It's too late for that. He has to be king now. He's never going to go back. It's an irrevocable change. So your character's need is to go on this journey of irrevocable change. And that's not something that they may be able to articulate in any way. They too, like Einstein's, you know, advice, they are going to figure out what needs to happen along the way. So it is a big subject, and I kind of love it. I kind of love that you asked that. I would love to know. Send me an email, Paul, or leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube, right? Leave a comment below with, give me like a real meaty version of that question so I can understand exactly what you mean by need and how we can address that. Because honestly, so many writers struggle with this. I call it, in my training, I call it the mission sometimes. You know, what is the character's mission? That's like the journey, the external journey that they go on, but it is just the outer form of this internal transformation. And to get from the start to the finish, that is really what is needed. What happens if they don't accomplish it? When we think about a need, what happens if that need is not fulfilled? If I have a need for a nap and I don't take a nap, I'm just grouchy and tired. But if I am a you know, a callow boy prince who refuses to, you know, grow up and behave, and I refuse to become king, right? And I just refuse. What happens? There is a terrible consequence if Prince Hal refuses to grow up, refuses to leave behind the, you know, rowdy companions of his youth and step up to lead the country. There's a terrible consequence, not just for him, but for the entire kingdom, right? So that's true in the Shakespeare plays, but it's true metaphorically, that when our hero refuses to go on this journey of change, it doesn't end well, not just for them, but for the balance of the whole outside world. So super, super question. Let's definitely talk about this more. All right. So I want to wrap up. These conversations are so much fun. And as you guys know, I'm so passionate about storytelling and writing. And I could easily talk about it all day, but I promise I won't, because you guys have lives to do and I've got stuff to do too. But we'll be back again. Next Wednesday, I am actually teaching at a writing conference. So I may do a little video to post in lieu of being able to appear live. So keep an eye out for that. And I definitely want to remind everyone who's here, who might not be on my mailing list. Let me see if I can put it up for you. I am teaching a course in story structure that is called Foundations, the Art of Story. And it's where I go way deep into this stuff. It's a fully developed course, 8 modules over 8 weeks with writing prompts and live coaching. I love to work with the students. We get to know each other really well. It's super fun. And enrollment is going to start tomorrow. So I'm going to send all the enrollment information to the people who are on my mailing list. If you're not on my mailing list, this would be a great time to get on, and so that you can hear about the course and see if maybe it's something that would be good for you right now. So that's www.pathofthestoryteller.com. You'll go there. There's a button that says put me on the waiting list. If you do that, then tomorrow when enrollment opens, you will get all the deets. All right. So I hope that some of you will take me up on that. It'd be great to have you in Path of the Storyteller. It's a wonderful program. We've got some incredible writers making breakthroughs by the day. My students are amazing. I think some of them might be watching this right now. All right, guys, thank you so much for another wonderful discussion. Great comments, great questions. And I look forward to next time. All right. Be well. I'll see you next time.